I hope you've had as amazing a first day of the 2023 Global Genes Rare Advocacy Summit as I have. And we've arrived at the last plenary session of the day. So it's my pleasure to introduce the closing plenary, which is compelling new models for patient engagement and trial participation, which will be led by Morrie Ruffin.
Great. Thank you very much. So welcome everybody. As you heard, this is the final plenary session of the day, although I think this is followed by the Champions of Hope presentations, which follows this immediately. I don't think there's a break, so everyone should remain in the room after the session is over. But anyway, we have a very, I think, interesting final discussion for you all here today. As you heard, the title is Compelling New Models of Patient Participation in Therapeutic Development. And I have with me two really fantastic discussants, panelists, and I'm going to introduce them here in a second. But just to set the stage for the conversation today, we've seen, and I think you've heard through the course of the meeting so far, and undoubtedly you'll hear about it more tomorrow, about all the incredible innovation going on in therapeutic development, in gene therapy, cell therapy, gene editing, mRNA therapies. I mean, there is a lot of work going on in trying to develop therapies and cures for rare disease. Obviously, not as quickly as we would like it to happen, and we all know what the challenges are facing us. But there's another aspect of this which has to do with the topic that we're going to cover today, which has to do with the experience of the patient, the clinical trial process, and how we are innovating and can innovate around that process to encourage broader participation, especially in underserved communities. And then this will really help meet the needs of drug development, especially with post-commercial follow-up, long-term follow-up of therapies. There's a lot to be done here, and we have with us two panelists who really are at the front lines of this and are going to share some of their experiences. And so I'm going to introduce them to you right now. So immediately to my left is Kelly McVearry, and Kelly is the co-founder and CEO of the Bento biology platforms. And I'm going to let her explain what that is, because Bento is not just a bento box and a word, it's an acronym. And I'll let Kelly explain that to you. But she comes to this conversation with incredible credentials. She's a neuroscientist. She's worked in a number of jobs in and around the healthcare field. She was at Northrop Grumman, believe it or not, where she was the chief scientist for information platforms innovation there. She's got a number of other experiences working with NCATS and NIH. And then also she's going to talk about her own experience with rare disease. And the focus of that is going to be a discussion initially about lupus. And so her work with the Lupus Research Alliance is part of what led her to the conversation we're going to have today about Bento and these engagement platforms. And then to her left, we have Ken Kalunian. And Ken is a partner of Kelly's. He's also the co-founder of the Bento biology platforms. He is a rheumatologist at UC San Diego, so right up the road. Actually just came to us from the clinic here a few minutes ago. So we're really delighted to have Ken with us here. But he's board certified internal medicine physician. He's also the director of the Lupus Clinical Trials Consortium and the San Diego Lupus Center of Excellence. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
You can correct it. When
it's all good.
But what I'd like to do next is have Kelly give a little bit more of her background. And then we have a couple of slides we're going to show you just to kind of get the conversation going and give you a little bit of context around Bento. So Kelly, I can advance if you would like me to. Well, there we are. So we're going to start there.
So I think with this crowd, I'm going to say that I became a patient 7 or 8 years ago after having started off as a pediatric neuropsychologist, which morphed into working very closely with families, but thinking of them as patients, and then becoming a scientist who did multi-site clinical trials, and one of the hardest things was always making sure that you could complete your trials in a reasonable amount of time. And I used to joke with friends that I would be 87 years old before I got my PhD because I had decided to work with human subjects for my thesis project. As Morrie said, I then started falling in love with what technology can do to improve health, and that landed me in the position of building really cool public health advanced technologies in the role of Northrop Grumman, which people don't usually realize had a precision medicine practice that allowed us to sequence the human genome in the first place. And after building a variety of very cool technology platforms for public health problems, I found myself becoming a patient. And that's where I met Ken, because we stood up a clinical trial network focused on lupus. And we learned through that, which we'll use as a use case today, that the friction in getting our lupus clinical trials to complete and accelerate therapeutic development was the same problem I had encountered getting my doctorate all those years ago, when we worried about patients dropping out of studies or not being able to participate because they lived in a rural location. I think that's enough, and I'll turn it over. Did you?
So I'm going to turn it over to Ken, because I want him to give a little bit of background on lupus, and then I want to come back and talk a little bit about Bento itself, if we could do that. So Ken, I think Kelly obviously mentioned her experience a little bit with lupus. Obviously, your clinic sees a lot of these patients. So could you just share with the audience a little bit kind of what your clinic does, kind of day to day, what types of patients you're seeing, some of the challenges you're facing in treating these patients, and just give us a little bit of context there, and really kind of their experience, because I think that's what we want to weave into the discussion around Bento.
Sure. So a little bit about my background. I trained in Los Angeles at UCLA. I was a fellow of Bev Rahan, who was basically one of the huge early leaders in lupus, making it really a field of study and a discipline and really a subspecialty. And I came here to San Diego as an opportunity to actually make things better for patients, because what I saw as a starting rheumatologist interested in lupus was a paucity of drugs. There were really only 3 drugs that we used, and I really thought that we hadn't characterized the disease well enough in terms of what it encompassed. We had some idea about its biology, its pathogenesis was a little vague, but we didn't really understand why it was expressed in so many different ways in so many different people, and why it was a disease that primarily affected people of different color and mostly women. And those were all really probing questions, and I had the idea that I was going to be an academician. I really wanted to be a clinician on the sort of available to anybody who wanted help. But I realized that there was more of a mission that was needed for me as a person to feel fulfilled in terms of being a physician. And so I came here for a couple of reasons. I was on my own. I had an opportunity to start on my own. I was in a community in Los Angeles where there were like 67 rheumatologists seeing lupus patients. Now, LA has a bigger population than San Diego, but still, that was really a hurdle for me to sort of make my own mark and bring to the table what I thought was something that really should happen. And what I really saw was that the fact that these people, who were all much older than me, but most of them were anyway, they had their own traditions, their own ways of practicing medicine, their own approach to lupus. They never really delved into, except for my mentor, the basis for these differences that I saw as really burdensome to me as a doctor, but more importantly to the patient. And I also came here because there were so many biotech companies here in San Diego. It's really the mecca for biotech companies, startups and whatnot. And I figured I could work with them to help them, sort of translate what I saw in my patients from a clinical science perspective into new therapeutics. And with that, with time, I met some people who were interested in doing the same thing as me, and we started the Lucin Network, which is a North American alliance where we want to bring drugs to the marketplace as quickly as we can. And that's how I met Kelly as well. She was asked to be on the board when we were designing our board, and it's been wonderful ever since. Just a bit about, and then I'll stop talking, just a bit about lupus itself. What I learned along the way is that lupus, which supposedly affects about 250,000 Americans, is really still a rare disease, because I don't believe it's one disease. I think it's really more than that. I think that most patients have skin disease and or joint disease. Some people just have skin disease, some people just have joint disease, and some people have just kidney disease, which is a devastating manifestation of the disease. And there are other patients who have a smattering of different diseases, but it's rare, really, to see patients who have a full house and many manifestations at the same time. It happens, but it's a rarity, really. And I thought what we could do from a clinical perspective is design a lupus center where we not only did research, but also did patient care, gave patient care, serviced patients in a way that was specifically addressing their needs. So in our clinic, we decided to start a cutaneous lupus clinic, a musculoskeletal clinic, a women's health issue related lupus clinic, and a kidney clinic. And all of those clinics exist with a rheumatologist, a lupologist really, and a person from that specific discipline. So a rheumatologist would be with a dermatologist in one clinic, a kidney doctor with a rheumatologist in another, and so on, and so on. And actually, with that, we're trying to develop drugs specifically for those manifestations, and have started and had 2 drugs approved. We didn't. I won't take responsibility for it, but our group was a big player in getting 2 drugs approved for kidney disease. And so we're now working on the other aspects of things. And it's been a very rewarding experience. We take care of 1,100 lupus patients here in San Diego. We take care of patients from every single subgroup that you can think of, racially and ethnically. And it's been a tremendous, I think, boom to my experience as a physician, and I think also for our patients. So thank you.
So I want to ask both of you to talk a little bit about the patient experience and how you how you measure that, how you monitor that, how you engage them in the process. I mean, we can talk about it, and perhaps, Kelly, a little bit in the context of clinical trials and some of the challenges getting a diverse patient population into these clinical trials, and how that inspired you to do what you've done with Bento, and then maybe describe Bento a little bit.
Sure. Well, I think we should ground this in the real-world example that we experienced standing up a clinical trial network that was designed to be this great accelerator of clinical trials that would enable therapeutic development, like Ken talked about. And we have an infrastructure of, at the time, 57 academic medical centers, 200 principal investigators, and reach back to 25,000 patients. And if we looked across our system, if we were honest with ourselves, people were not banging down the doors to participate in the trials. Pharma wanted us to recruit patients, and I started having patient-to-patient conversations. And we learned that trials were just too inconvenient. We learned from the voice of patients that we started measuring pretty rigorously, that for them to participate, which they all had the idea would be nice, it would mean taking off multiple days of work and using their vacation time. And so we started looking at who enrolls in clinical trials in lupus, and it was privileged people who didn't have to take time off work. It wasn't people living in rural areas. And so then we had the pandemic. And the pandemic caused us to have to shut down the clinical trials that were in play. And that's where the excitement started, because it gave us permission to think another way. And so we thought, we've not been getting people banging on the door to enroll. Let's bring the clinical trial to patient doorsteps. And so we decided to make it fun. And Ken was talking about the interdisciplinary collaboration that he makes happen in his clinics. And we put together a multifunctional team that included people like Ken. It included software engineers to start to think about what could we do to make this clinical trial participation process a really modern, super consumer-grade digital experience. But then we also brought in not just software developers, clinicians, and solution architects. We brought in toy designers because we really thought, how can we make this as fun as possible so that people don't feel like guinea pigs? And Bento was born that way. And Bento is an acronym for Biomedical Equity for Next Generation Trials and Outcomes. And we thought, we actually did a little sketch one night in the middle of the pandemic where I sketched and took a picture and I texted it to Ken and he said, ooh, we could put this in here, we could put this in here. And we really designed this kitting system to be a marketplace of the best-in-class innovation that's out there for self-service biosampling and biosensing. And we put a technology wrapper around it so that it could be an Apple-grade consumer experience, so that you could get something that lands on your doorstep. And so we wanted people to get this kind of plain box that didn't signal a disease on it. And then we wanted them to open something up that they were excited to play with. And so there's a patient support group on the side. There's a positive message, hello cure, that's fun. And then an out-of-the-box experience begins that says, let's do it. Simple instructions, minimal language, lots of pictures. But what our user community really loved with this first message of, you open up this card and you've got inside of it, oh, here's the card, I'm sorry, I played with the box too much. There's a Bento Bio shareholder card in there that lets you create a wallet. And from out of the gate, we wanted to test the value proposition of saying to patients that you're a value creator in this enterprise of therapeutic development, and that wallet was going to provide you with real-time micro rewards for the contributions you were making each time you performed a task. And we needed to test this to see, can you collect reliable data? Can you collect blood yourself? It turns out you can. Can you collect, we all know you can do the saliva because everybody's exposed to 23andMe these days. And so we just turned this into a biosampling experience that was fun, that would allow you to scan something and launch a fun, modern animation that is, in pharma-sponsored term, a standard operating procedure. But we turned it into something that doesn't require having to fiddle with IKEA-like instructions. And then we tested it with patients, and we haven't stopped. So I think I'll just pause there, because I think that's, we focused on building trust. We focused on making sure things were, again, consumer-grade, out-of-the-box experience. And then we started asking, the part of this that's not visible is we asked basic questions. What do you want to be paid? What's fair market value to you for your time to participate in doing the work of a clinical trial as a value creator? And when we framed it that way, we've had 100% compliance so far with people participating. Patients just liked being asked, here's what I think about fair market value for my time. So we've turned the clinical trial participation experience into something that is also done in parallel with thinking about incentives, gamifying participation, and so far the results are pretty good.
Fantastic.
Yep.
Ken, can you talk about a little bit from your perspective too, as a clinician? I mean, why something like this, why innovation, with these types of tools and platforms is important in your work?
Yeah, so on a very practical level, this revolutionizes the way in which we can conduct clinical trials in many ways. First of all, we have better access to the patients. Patients have better access to clinical trials. They don't have to actually even leave their house. They get this and a video visit from their physician who's enrolling them in the clinical trial with this, which provides the samples that we need from whatever, and it can be different for every trial or every step along the way even. So it's very convenient for them. They don't have to hassle with driving. They can do it on their own time. They can not be pigeonholed into our availability. The only thing that they can't do is really get an intervention that requires intravenous or subcutaneous administration of a drug. Actually, we could probably do subcutaneous drug administration remotely. But yeah, it opens up the doors for so many, makes it easier for the patients who would ordinarily be enrolled in a clinical trial, who have access to a clinical trial. But more importantly, it opens up the field for people who don't have access to a site like ours. We have, like Kelly said, we have 50 some odd clinical sites, but most of them are in metropolitan areas. There are very few. There's actually one in the Midwest, all of the Midwest. And certainly there are people who live in remote areas, particularly on Native American reservations, people in Alaska, but with this, they have access to us. So yeah, I mean, it really serves many, many purposes, not only from a therapeutic perspective, but it also helps us define who has lupus. People don't necessarily, who live in remote places, ever get the diagnosis of lupus. So we're really serving them well to get a diagnosis from an expert who would ordinarily not have availability, or they wouldn't have availability to see somebody who had that expertise. So to me, it's a game changer.
Yeah. So, I think one of the things that this audience is really interested in is, you're talking about in the context of lupus with a larger patient population.
Yeah.
But in the rare diseases and ultra rare diseases, and thinking about some of the challenges these communities have in organizing and recruiting for clinical trials, how can this be applied there as well? I mean, I know, Kelly, you've been thinking about it, so I'm teeing you up there. But yeah, if you could talk about that, and Ken, I know you're a rheumatologist, but I mean,
yeah,
you could certainly speak to that too.
Oh yeah. I mean, so the problem that exists in lupus is magnified many times over in rarer diseases, right? Because there may be 53 people who can do what I do and enroll patients into clinical trials or even deliver care, but when you talk about rare diseases, there may be only a couple of people who actually have the expertise to really care for patients, or even to enroll patients into clinical trials, or even do epidemiologic studies to understand the nature of the disease. But with something like this, you actually bring the patients into those areas of expertise. So for them, it's a whole new world.
When you develop friendships with the caregivers, the parents who have rare disease, as I have, and back when I wore a clinical hat and specialized in pediatric neurodevelopment, the stories of the diagnostic odysseys that are probably familiar to many in this room involved getting the family in the car and driving up and down the East Coast where I live to go to this clinic, the next clinic, the next clinic, all in search of an accurate diagnosis. I had the great good fortune of meeting somebody named Christina Hartman on a board that we both served on. And she was one of the lucky ones by her own admission because she could march her daughter across the street practically to NIH to participate in a trial. And despite that proximity to NIH, she still had her own months-long diagnostic odyssey. And when she saw this, she became a champion because she said, you could bring this to the family's doorstep and you could start to have a discovery process that essentially subtracted the miles that people were traveling. There are new biosampling tools that allow us to do more. When we first got started with this a few years ago, the blood sampling that you could do was really limited to either dried blood spots or, I'm holding in this, something we called trickle and spin. And inside this, I'm not gonna torture you with opening it up, but there's like 22 objects in it. And it was all carefully laid out, but you're asking, V1 was asking people, rare families or a lupus family, to essentially prick your finger and milk your blood into a little device, and then it had a little handheld centrifuge so you could separate out the materials of your blood so that it would be okay at room temperature to ship and go to a lab. And it worked. But the technology in just a few years has gotten so much better, and this opens up really game-changing possibilities for rare families in really introducing a level of convenience that hasn't existed before, and that is essentially a single device that doesn't have 20 pieces, that's a touch-activated, bladeless microneedle array that allows you to get a microtainer of capillary liquid blood that now is controlled at room temperature and can be shipped to a lab. And it really opens up new doors. It's just recently gotten FDA approved. It's been used by a lot of the Moderna trials, and so we know that it works in a large population there. And so these are the kinds of innovations that as we start to see what's a better way to biosample, how can we reduce the perceived burden, the experience burden of families, and then we put it into a fun wrapper and just make lives easier and provide a real-time return of value. That's the other piece of this that we didn't talk about. In building those in trust with people, we wanted to make sure we weren't just taking from them. That's one of the recurring complaints that people have shared about their prior experiences with participating in the clinical trial enterprise, is that it's a one-way street. Data isn't returned back. One of the things I have loved about the rare disease community and the leadership of what RareX has done is that they believe, like we do, that patients are entitled to owning their biology and have created awesome data sharing initiatives. And so we have tried to build into every digital experience a real-time return of value, whether it's being able to visualize symptoms that they report so in a way that's useful for them, and making sure that they have self-sovereignty over their biological assets. So
I think one of the things that's remarkable about this is that the innovation and thinking around this is coming from the patients themselves.
yes.
And your interactions with caregivers and really from this community. And you mentioned Nicole and RareX and Shirley and all the incredible work that they're doing here.
Yes.
I think they really
Yes.
appreciate that and recognize that. Still the burden of this, and you talked about burden, is falling on a pretty narrow group of people. I mean, this is coming out of a rare disease population, a community from your own experience. And then we've talked about how important this is and how it can empower patients and other groups. But we really need others to recognize this. And so that includes the drug companies, other groups that could be partners in the process. Ken, you mentioned some of them, obviously, a lot of them down here in San Diego. So how do we get them engaged in this? I mean, I know you're starting that process,
Yep.
but talk a little bit about that. And Ken, if you've got a perspective you can add to that too, I'd like to hear it. But how do you get them interested? How do you get them to buy into this
Yep.
and support it so that the financial burden still isn't on the rare disease community to develop?
I mean, it's a great question, and honestly, the proof is in the numbers. We designed this to be an experiment a few years ago, and we launched it into the world with a small group of lupus patients, and we said to them up front, you are co-creating this. The products we offer today are not what they looked like when we started. Every single time somebody said, I can't really open that box, and here's why, because this is what's wrong with my hands. Okay, so we made everything accessible. And accessibility is a nice story, but it isn't the same as really, it was a patient-centered process is what I wanted to say. But that is, patient-centered is a buzzword that we've all used, and great things have been accomplished with a patient-centered mindset. But it hasn't moved the needle. We really haven't diversified clinical trials that much. We really still only have 1% of the population participating in a clinical trial in their lifetime. And so what we want to say to pharma, and we're starting to have those conversations, is just look at the voice of the patient once we have used our system and look at the compliance. And the numbers really do speak for themselves. When we couple this with the patient tech assessment, it's like we've vetted the biosampling tools that go into the system, but then we have a second vetting that we ask the participants of the system to do for each and every object and experience that they have. And they get a micro reward every time they do that assessment. We're not just taking their knowledge, we're actually providing compensation in real time through a micro reward system. And those micro rewards are meaningful and importantly defined by the patients. We have this menu of micro rewards that people get they have this redeemable experience as they complete tasks. And those redeemables are very trivial financial events for the pharma sponsor, but they entirely get compliance. The patients love them. I love them as a patient.
I'd love to hear what Ken says about it.
Yeah.
Do you see that, in your interaction with the patient?
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
I've seen it firsthand. Yeah, I think it makes a huge difference. It really engages them. It really makes it really fun.
The point is pharma can get compliance and we can solve the accrual problem. Is something that pervades all, it's a burden on all, it's a friction for all clinical trials. And then you have to worry about people dropping out because the burden is too high. Patients don't realize I have to take all this time off work to participate. And we're just subtracting that. Mm-hmm. And so you're accelerating that awkward operational innovation-resistant part of the clinical trial process with something that's fun.
Yeah. And to your point about how do we convince, biotech and pharmaceutical companies to employ this, and I think that we're actually getting to a crucial point where their hands are going to be forced to look at our innovative ways of,
How so?
Well, because nobody wants to do clinical trials in rare diseases, and I see that every day. I think except in cancer, where there's an awareness that, a sense of desperation to achieve a cure, I think the rest of the disciplines in medicine, to a large extent, are immune from that special aspect of cancer clinical trials. So in lupus right now, there are 47 clinical trials, plus another probably 37 CAR T and cell-based therapy programs for a disease that affects 250,000 people. Well, that's crazy. We're never going to be able to enroll that many patients into these trials. So the companies are, just today I had 2 companies stop by my office when I was done seeing patients, saying, we've got 2 patients in our clinical trial. We've been open for 7 months. What can we do to make things better?
Yep.
So I think that these fields are historically resistant to change because these companies that we deal with all the time have had successes in terms of recruitment. But it's post-COVID, it's a different world. And I think that really changes things a lot.
It does raise this other point, Morrie, if I may, which is the frequently asked question we get from pharma sponsors is oftentimes thinly veiled skepticism that patients and the caregivers of patients can be trusted to do a good job biosampling. And so the world is going to need, we're going to need to invest in some validation studies to prove it out. But the good news is that FDA wants to see this change. In the recent months, they've released guidances to industry for decentralized clinical trials. They're currently out for comment. The final version is going to be released this coming December. And this really focuses on the possibility of having at-home participation in clinical trials or hybrid trials where you have to have a reduced number of visits to a clinic with moments of convenient at-home biosampling. So pharma is giving permission, the regulators are giving permission to pharma to take some of these risks, to do these validation studies, and to trust patients to do some of these biosampling tasks that we haven't been trusted to do.
That's a great point. We have about 5 minutes left, and I know we want to leave time for questions.
Yeah.
And I have a couple of others if we can't find them. But I'd like to open up the floor to questions for Kelly and Ken. So if you've got a question, we have microphones. Here's one here. There's 2 mics up front. I think there's circulating mics too. One here. Okay. You're going to get it eventually.
Hello. Thank you so much for the presentation. Having myself built a very crude version of what you guys have built with the Bento biology kit, I'm really impressed by it. 2 questions for you. First, what does the IRB think of this, and how was that process in getting them to have a look at that? And the second question is, since we're among groups of many rare and ultra-rare disease patient communities, I understand the commercial version of this. Is there an accessible version of this that may be relevant to the nonprofit organizations that might be here advocating for very rare disorders? Thank you.
Well, IRBs have a life of their own, and it really depends on the IRB. But our philosophy is to engage early and often. And also, IRBs must be conservative to protect the safety of the humans that participate in trials. But I think that goes back to the point about regulators saying to industry and also implicitly to IRBs, we need to think in a new way because the greater risk is not being inclusive to all people in all locations. And so that's going to be a hand-to-hand combat, trial-by-trial basis to answer that question. And I don't feel like that's a satisfactory answer, but I do think that that's the real answer. The second question that you asked is that we want to collaborate. This looks like a business, but our philosophy is really a community collaboration model where we want to, and we're doing it with the organization we launched this with was a nonprofit organization, the Lupus Research Alliance. They wanted to invest in this because they loved the results that they saw. But our plan is to get into a revenue sharing model with patient community organizations so that you can use this yourselves and from the bottom up have self-organizing patient communities propose this to the pharma sponsors that are having a hard time getting the results that they want. So.
Other questions? If you've got, raise your hand if you've got a question. Any others? There's one over here.
I just wanted to ask whether any of the clinical trials involved clinical assessments and whether they can be done by video or not.
Right, so that's a really good question. Currently, it depends on the disease, right? And it just depends on the manifestations of the disease. So many things can be done by remote monitoring and examination, but some things can't. I mean, obviously you can't listen to a heart, you can't listen to lungs, but there are surrogates of the heart with an EKG, for example. And that's actually, in clinical trials, probably the most important thing, and that can be included in a Bento type of approach. The other thing for my disease that is difficult is actually assessing joints. However, in lupus, the way we assess joints in lupus is adapted from how we assess joints in rheumatoid arthritis. And the way in which arthritis presents in lupus is very different. So we're using the wrong approach anyway, and so we're going to have to figure out a surrogate for that. Which has emerged recently are biomarkers of clinical presentations. And we have that, we're developing them. We have some early data for the kidney in lupus, for example. The surrogate of the skin is a photograph. That's simple, but we also have some ideas of surrogate biomarkers that we can use for the joints, and so we can do this very quickly. The rheumatology world is connected with the NIH in a partnership with industry partners, academia, and the NIH to develop biomarkers. And so that's an emerging field as well. It's actually coming along really quickly. So we're maybe not quite there yet for everything that I do, but hopefully we will be soon. And for other rare diseases, I think it's more implicit to actually have some other way of assessing the clinical well-being and the clinical presentations and manifestations of individual patients with time, but it's doable, I think.
Okay. Yes. One more. I think this will have to be the last question because we're out of time, and then we'll stop. So go ahead, please.
Kelly, you referenced micro rewards for participants. Could you give an example of that? And then also, have you been approached by other rare disease organizations to participate in something?
Yes, so thank you for the question. So we really wanted to talk about the concept today without really being like a product pitch. But one of the things that is part of our platform system is a symptom diary, and that is the mechanism by which you have a frictionless, gamified way of reporting your symptoms and actually getting your points for completing your tasks. You have a simple wallet. This is what we call a Web 2 wallet, meaning that it's under a centralized control and we take care of all the data security, et cetera. But patients are racking and stacking their points for task completion, whether it's reporting your symptoms daily in a very visual way or whether it's completing one of these tasks. There's a menu. The menu is determined by the sponsoring trial, the sponsor of the trial or the patient group. So in the case of lupus, we started off with a menu of things that were voiced to be of interest of the demographic of patients that were participating. Those included Walmart gift cards, Amazon gift cards, Starbucks gift cards. It evolved into healthy meal kits. And we actually have a fully operating Bitcoin node in the back end for people who want to stack Satoshis, the smallest unit of Bitcoin. We have a micro donation link if you want to rack and stack your points, but you don't want to redeem it for a latte. You could also take those points and make a micro donation to the organization of your choice. Those are not set in stone. Those are designed to evolve based on the needs of a patient community. And so we started with a few of those. That list exists because that's what the voice of the patient told us they wanted. Every single time they had an idea, if it was technically feasible, we did it. For a pediatric group, we'd had an entirely different set of redeemables and micro rewards. We met last week with a pharma sponsor that had a couple of ideas about things we hadn't thought of that they would want for their trials. So the whole thing about a platform is that it's composable, and it's designed to rapidly be deployed to meet the needs of a patient community. And I forget your second question.
By other rare diseases?
You know, not by specific rare disease communities. You know, we're just getting out of the gate right now. And so if you've got an idea, we're ready to go. So I'll show you right here. We had a conversation with the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. They said, we'd really like to use this for sickle cell. And we mocked this up. And if they're here today, I'm going to give this to them. So, you know, it's this is a mini bento. We'd love to be serving the rare disease community. It's near and dear to my heart, and we really want to be able to collaborate and serve the pediatric populations out there. So,
okay. I think we are out of time, unfortunately, and I mean, I'm sure there are other questions. We didn't get into the issue of data collection, the provenance of data, and the quality of data, but that's a conversation we can have for another time. But I really appreciate both of you coming here today. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of thought going into this. There's a lot of passion behind this. And obviously, I think we can see how important this is going to be to the development of therapies for rare disease. So thank you.
thank you to Global Genes. We love Global
Genes.
Genes.